The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carries weight, pressing down on every shoulder, forcing every heartbeat to echo louder than usual. A man stood at the defendant's table, his hands trembling, his voice caught somewhere between fear and desperation. He looked at the judge, eyes heavy with stories untold, and whispered the words that would stop the room cold. "Judge, can I give you a hug?" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The bailiff blinked in disbelief. The audience behind him leaned forward, caught between confusion and awe. Even Judge Caprio, a man who had seen decades of confessions, excuses, and pleas, sat back in his chair as though the world had tilted slightly off balance. A hug. In a courtroom built on rules and punishments, where steel and order often mattered more than flesh and feeling, this was unthinkable. But the trembling voice carried a weight far greater than its volume. It wasn't just a request for an embrace. It was a plea for recognition, a desperate cry for humanity in a place where most expected judgment, not compassion. Those 5 words, simple, fragile coot, sharper than any lawyer's argument or gavel's strike. Gasps rippled through the benches. A woman in the back raised her hand to her mouth. A young man shifted, whispering, "Did he just..." Nobody knew what would happen next. Because hugs don't belong in courtrooms. It's not here. Not like this. And yet, in that moment, something shifted. You could almost feel the walls themselves listening, as if the building, long accustomed to fines and rulings, was being forced to hold its breath. This wasn't just about a ticket, or a fine, or the technicalities of the law. This was about something bigger, something human. And as the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing with both surprise and curiosity, the world outside that small Providence courtroom had no idea that it was about to witness a moment that would capture hearts across continents. Because the question was not simply, "Can I give you a hug?" The real question, the one trembling behind those words, was, why? And the reason would leave the entire courtroom in tears and millions watching online speechless to understand why this hug mattered.
Asterisk.
We need to rewind. Asterisk Providence, Rhode Island. A city where the streets carry stories in every crack of pavement, where ordinary people live paycheck to paycheck, and where even the smallest mistake can snowball into disaster. Inside its modest courthouse, lives are measured not in headlines or grand trials, but in parking tickets, expired registrations, and forgotten fines. It is the courtroom of everyday struggle. At first glance, these cases seem trivial. A late-night parking violation, a speeding ticket caught on camera, a license renewal missed by a week. On paper, they are mere inconveniences, the kind of things brushed off by those with comfortable salaries and safety nets. But for the working poor, for immigrants piecing together a life with threadbare resources, for parents juggling 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, these small infractions are anything but small. Because here's the truth most never see. One unpaid ticket doesn't just stay a ticket. It grows. Interest piles on. Additional penalties arrive. Suddenly, that $50 fine balloons into $200. Miss one more payment, and you could lose your license. Without your license, you can't drive to work. Without work, you can't pay rent. The spiral tightens, and soon, a simple slip of paper on a windshield becomes the stone that drags a family underwater. Judge Caprio's courtroom is where these battles play out. It's a place where the cold machinery of bureaucracy collides with the fragile humanity of people who are already on the edge. And that collision between the rigid letter of the law and the messy, desperate realities of human life creates moments that reveal who we are as a society. Some defendants walk in, armed with excuses, their stories rehearsed and defensive. Others arrive weary, stripped of pretense, their only defense being the raw truth of their circumstances. It is in these moments that Judge Caprio's philosophy, the belief that compassion has a place in justice, becomes more than theory. It becomes survival. And on this particular day, survival was exactly what stood at the center of the room. The man before him was not a criminal mastermind, nor a repeat offender testing the system's patience. He was an ordinary man, carrying extraordinary weight. His fines, though small by government standards, represented nights of skipped meals, bills delayed, choices no family should have to make. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the unspoken tension that everyone in the room could feel. They had seen people break down before, they had seen frustration boil over, but this was different. There was a fragility about him, as though each word he spoke might shatter into 1,000 pieces if handled too harshly. And then, after the charges were read, after the routine questions were asked, he finally opened his mouth, not to bargain, not to deny, not to plead for mercy in the traditional sense. What came out was something else entirely. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a tactic. It was a confession, one that would silence the entire courtroom, pierce straight through the robes and rules, and leave Judge Caprio himself stunned. Because when this defendant finally spoke, what came out wasn't an excuse. It was a truth that would stop Judge Caprio cold. Every story of justice has a villain. But in this courtroom, the villain was not a man in a black hat or a sneering politician. It was something colder, quieter, and far more relentless. The system itself, bureaucracy, a machine of rules, fines and forms that ground down anyone too weak to push back. Its power didn't roar, it whispered. It tightened slowly around families until the light in their eyes dimmed. This villain wore many faces. A ticket slipped beneath a windshield wiper in the middle of the night. A letter stamped final notice in bold red ink. A summons arriving in the mail with language so technical, so intimidating, that ordinary people couldn't even understand what they were accused of until it was too late. Each one seemed minor on its own, but stacked together, they built cages invisible to the outside world. Consider Maria. A single mother cited 3 times for parking outside her apartment because the nearest legal space was blocks away. Each citation doubled in penalties when she couldn't pay on time. Within months, her license was suspended. She walked to work in the dead of winter, late more often than not, until her boss finally let her go. A parking ticket ended her livelihood. Or Jamal, a refugee who had fled violence abroad only to be trapped by paperwork here. He misunderstood a court date for a minor infraction, missed it, and discovered that his absence triggered additional fees he could never afford. What began as a simple misunderstanding escalated into the threat of jail. The system had no patience for confusion. It demanded precision, but only from those least equipped to give it. These were not anomalies. They were patterns. The machine churned, unforgiving, and everywhere across the country, judges followed its dictates with stone faces. In most courtrooms, empathy was dismissed as weakness. Justice meant efficiency. Call the next case, impose the fine, move along. Humanity became a distraction, an inconvenience to be swept aside. And yet, here in Providence, one man had chosen to stand apart from that rhythm. Judge Frank Caprio. Where other judges saw numbers, he saw neighbors. Where they saw rules, he saw people struggling beneath them. His courtroom was not famous for its severity, but for its softness, for his ability to listen where others silenced. Clips of him went viral not because of his rulings, but because of his humanity. People saw in him the judge they wished they had met. The kind of figure who proved that compassion and justice need not be opposites. But even Caprio's approach did not erase the villain lurking in the background. The machine never stopped running. Every defendant who entered his courtroom carried the weight of it. He could waive fines, he could extend grace, but he could not dismantle the system itself. And that system was always waiting, looming over the shoulders of the vulnerable, ready to pounce the moment mercy ran out. This is what made his role both noble and tragic. A single man of compassion, holding back an ocean of cruelty. He could rescue some, but he could not rescue all. And on this day, that tension, the balance between mercy and the machinery, was about to be tested like never before. Because the defendant before him was not simply another case in the stack. He was a living, breathing embodiment of everything the system crushed. Poverty, isolation, exhaustion. The kind of man who carried scars the bureaucracy would never recognize. Caprio had faced many stories, many confessions. But what this man was about to reveal would pierce deeper than any he had heard before. It was one thing to forgive a ticket, to grant time for repayment, to dismiss a charge out of compassion. But what happens when the story behind the fine is so raw, so heartbreaking, that it forces even the most compassionate judge to pause? The villain, after all, was not going to vanish. The system would still demand its due. The paperwork would still flow, the fines would still stack, the penalties would still threaten. And yet, in this single moment, one man's trembling voice had the power to expose just how merciless that villain truly was. But this time, even Caprio himself would be tested. To understand why that trembling request, "Can I give you a hug?" struck so deeply, you have to know the man sitting behind the bench. Frank Caprio did not emerge from privilege or distance. He was not born into mahogany courtrooms or marble hallways. He was the son of immigrants, raised in the working-class neighborhoods of Providence, where family dinners stretched every dollar and dignity was the only wealth that could not be repossessed. His father arrived in America with little more than determination, carrying the burden of hope for a better life. He laid bricks by hand, building walls for other men's homes, while dreaming of stability for his own children. His mother, too, lived sacrifice as second nature, patching clothes, saving pennies, making sure the children's needs came first. They taught Frank a lesson that no textbook could ever capture: that justice without humanity is nothing more than cruelty wrapped in procedure. Growing up, young Frank watched his parents navigate a world that didn't always make room for them. They were immigrants, outsiders, in a system that often valued their labor but ignored their lives. He saw the fatigue in his father's hands, the worry in his mother's eyes, and he understood long before he ever studied law that rules could crush the very people they were supposed to protect. Those lessons carried him through school, where he pursued education not as a luxury, but as a duty to his family. He worked, he studied, he sacrificed. When he finally earned his law degree, it wasn't merely his triumph. It was the triumph of every brick his father laid, every meal his mother went without. And when he stepped into the role of judge, he did not see a gavel as a weapon of authority, but as a responsibility to wield fairness with a human hand. Judge Caprio built a philosophy that set him apart: the belief that justice must have a face, a heart, and a conscience. He knew the law could be cold, blind to suffering, but he also knew that a judge had a choice to mirror that coldness, or to breathe warmth into it. Over decades, he chose warmth. He listened. He asked questions that mattered. He treated each defendant not as a case number, but as a person with a story. This is why his courtroom became famous, not for its severity, but for its humanity. Clips of him forgiving a struggling mother's fine so she could feed her children, or letting a nervous young man explain his late-night parking ticket without humiliation, spread across the internet. Millions watched, not because of the outcomes, but because of the way he made people feel seen. But compassion did not make him weak. In fact, it made him stronger. It required courage to stand against the relentless efficiency of the system. To say, wait, before we punish, let us understand. In a society obsessed with speed and order, he was willing to slow down and listen. That patience was radical. That empathy was defiance. And so, by the time this trembling defendant stood before him, Judge Caprio had already spent a lifetime preparing for moments exactly like this. Every story of struggle he had heard, every tear he had witnessed, every immigrant parent he remembered from his own childhood, they all converged in this instant. He knew what it meant to carry weight unseen by others. He knew the quiet dignity of people who endured without complaint until their burdens became unbearable. The defendant's whisper was not just a courtroom oddity. It was the echo of every lesson his parents taught him, every value his community instilled in him, every conviction he had fought to uphold as a judge. A hug, simple as it sounded, was really a plea for recognition, for acknowledgement that beneath the fines and paperwork stood a human being, and Frank Caprio was uniquely prepared to hear it. Where another judge might have dismissed it as theatrics, he understood it as truth. Where another might have snapped back with formality, he felt the pulse of desperation within it. He knew instinctively that the man before him wasn't asking for leniency and dollars, he was asking for dignity and humanity. The courtroom in that split second became more than a chamber of justice. It became the stage for everything Caprio believed in, that compassion is not weakness, that kindness is not indulgence, The justice without mercy is hollow. And soon, one trembling voice would put those beliefs to the ultimate test. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual, filling the silence as the defendant shifted nervously at the podium. His hands gripped the edges as though letting go might cause him to collapse entirely. Judge Caprio, leaning slightly forward, gave the smallest Nadan invitation to speak. And then the words began to flow, halting at first, broken by hesitation, but carrying the unmistakable weight of truth. Your Honor, I didn't ignore the ticket because I didn't care. I ignored it because I couldn't pay. I've been choosing between rent and food and the ticket. The ticket just didn't fit anywhere into that choice. The room stiffened. This was not the usual defense. No rehearsed excuse, no clever argument. It was raw survival laid bare, spoken without shield or armor. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting briefly toward the floor before locking back on the judge. My wife's been sick. Hospital visits, medication. Every dollar I had went there. Some days, I skipped meals to make sure she ate. Some nights, I slept in my car outside the hospital just so I wouldn't waste gas driving back and forth. And when that fine came, it felt like a mountain I could never climb. A murmur rippled across the courtroom benches. A few lowered their eyes, ashamed at how easily they had once dismissed people like him. Others leaned forward, straining not to miss a word. The system, the cold, unbending machine, did not care about his wife's illness, or his empty stomach, or the quiet nights spent alone in a car seat. To the bureaucracy, he was nothing more than a line item. Defendant number 47, fine unpaid, penalty overdue. The gavel could fall, the papers could be signed, and the machinery would continue grinding without hesitation. But in this small room, the man's voice made the system's cruelty visible. Every pause, every crack in his tone was a reminder that behind the paperwork lived a human being with pain that could not be measured in dollars. I know I should have come sooner, he said, his voice faltering, but I was embarrassed. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, to know how far I've fallen. I thought, maybe I could fix it before it got this bad, but I couldn't. His throat tightened. I failed my family, and now I'm here. The last words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. The clerk stopped writing. The bailiff shifted uneasily. Even the air itself seemed to pause, unwilling to move until the weight of that confession had settled fully on everyone present. For Judge Caprio, the moment was piercing. The law, by its very design, demanded order. The rules were clear, the penalties automatic. Yet staring back at him was a man who had been fighting battles unseen by the law. Battles that left him hollow but unbroken enough to still stand here and speak. The system wanted its due. It demanded punishment. But compassion whispered another path. The tension coiled tighter, the choice looming larger, to follow the cold script or to answer the trembling humanity before him. And then, just as the silence threatened to collapse under its own weight, the defendant's voice cracked once more. He looked up, his eyes glassy, and spoke the words that would shock the entire courtroom. Then came the question no one expected, words that would pierce through the courtroom walls. The courtroom sat in that fragile silence only a few rare moments can command, the kind of silence that feels almost physical, pressing against skin, heavy in the lungs. The defendant, trembling but resolute, lifted his eyes toward the bench where Judge Caprio waited, his gavel resting like a dormant weapon. And then, with a voice fragile enough to crack, but steady enough to matter, he spoke the words that no one in that room could have predicted. Judge, can I give you a hug? For a split second, time fractured. It was as if someone had hit a pause button on reality. Pens froze mid-scribble. A cough died in someone's throat. The shuffling of papers ceased. The courtroom, usually a place of interruption, objection, and the constant hum of bureaucracy was stilled by 6 simple words. 6 words that didn't belong to the vocabulary of law, but to the language of humanity. Gasps rippled through the benches. A few muffled chuckles, nervous, confused, flickered out before dissolving into stunned silence. A woman in the back instinctively placed her hand over her mouth. A man leaned forward, his brows furrowed in disbelief. The bailiff, usually stone-faced, blinked and shifted awkwardly. Unsure whether he had just witnessed a breach of decorum or the start of something larger than the rules he was sworn to uphold, in Judge Caprio. His face, so often the stage for stern lectures softened with humor, betrayed genuine surprise. His eyebrows lifted, his lips parted slightly, but no sound came. He had heard pleas before. He had heard excuses, apologies, anger, even laughter. But this? A hug? That request cut through the layers of procedure, paperwork, and penalty with a rawness that the system had never prepared him for. The defendant's voice cracked as he repeated it, softer this time. "Please, Judge. Can I just give you a hug?" A breathless hush followed. Even the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead seemed quieter, as though the room itself leaned in, waiting for the response. Caprio leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in thought. He could feel the collective tension of the room. Was this appropriate? Could it be allowed? Would granting such a request erode the seriousness of the court, the authority of the bench? These questions hung in the air like ghosts of the bureaucracy he had spent his career resisting. But beneath them pulsed a deeper truth. This wasn't about courtroom protocol anymore. This was about a trembling soul reaching out for dignity, for connection, for something larger than justice. Compassion. Caprio set down his pen. He exhaled, his decision already written in the gentle crease of his smile. "Come here," he said softly. The defendant froze, as if unsure he had heard correctly. Then slowly he rose from his seat. His steps were hesitant at first, like a man walking across ice, uncertain if the surface beneath him would hold. The courtroom watched in suspended awe. Every creak of the wooden floor, every shuffle of his shoes, echoed like drum beats leading toward an inevitable climax. Caprio stood from the bench. Law and those it judged. The audience murmured, the whispers swelling into a tide of astonishment. Never had they seen a judge descend, not to admonish, not to enforce, but to embrace. They met at the center of the room. For a brief heartbeat, they just looked at each other. One man in a plain shirt worn thin by hardship, the other in the dark robe of authority, its weight heavier than fabric. And then, they embraced. It wasn't a quick, polite embrace. It wasn't a staged gesture. It was long, unguarded, the kind of hug that transfers weight from one soul to another. The defendant clutched Caprio as if holding onto a lifeline, his shoulders shaking, his breath hitching. Caprio, for his part, wrapped his arms firmly as though silently saying, "You are not alone. You are seen. You are human, not a case number." The courtroom, once so rigid, melted. A woman dabbed tears from her cheeks. A young man lowered his head, hiding his own swelling emotion. Even the bailiff, stoic guardian of order, swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. And then came the sound. First a sniffle, then a sigh, and finally the unmistakable rhythm of applause. Tentative at first, scattered claps echoing like raindrops on tin. But then it grew, gathering force until the entire courtroom, defendants, spectators, even clerks, rose in ovation. The walls themselves seemed to reverberate with approval, as if justice had finally remembered its human core. The system, that faceless, unyielding antagonist, was, in that moment, defeated. Its rules, its fines, its cold bureaucratic rituals crumbled in the face of two people simply being human together. As they slowly pulled apart, Caprio placed a reassuring hand on the defendant's shoulder. "You've been through enough," he said quietly. His voice carried not judgment, but affirmation. In those few words, he delivered something no sentence, no waiver, no dismissal could match. Dignity. The defendant nodded, unable to speak. His eyes glistened, but his face carried something new. Not shame, not fear, but relief. The kind that comes when, for the first time in a long time, someone chooses to see you not as a problem, but as a person. The audience held their breath, reluctant to let the moment end. And in truth, it didn't. Because even as the applause quieted, even as the courtroom settled back into its wooden benches and fluorescent hum, something irreversible had shifted. The law had bent, not broken, to allow kindness through. The hug became more than physical. It was metaphorical armor against the cruelty of a system that often forgets the stories behind the statistics. It was the mic drop counterattack against bureaucracy. Proof that compassion is not weakness but strength. For decades, law had demanded separation, judge above, defendant below. But in that embrace, the hierarchy dissolved. Authority and vulnerability stood side by side, united by shared humanity. The villain, the faceless system, had lost. Not in a dramatic courtroom battle of evidence and objections, but in a quiet human act of love. The defendant returned to his seat. Lighter somehow, as if the hug itself had lifted a burden heavier than any fine. Caprio resumed his bench. But the atmosphere of the room remained transformed, charged with the electricity of something unexplainable. Unforgettable. And as the video clip of that moment would later travel across social media, news outlets, and living rooms around the world, millions would feel that same pause, that same gasp, that same release of tears. The hug didn't end in that courtroom. It became a ripple that extended far beyond those walls, a lesson, a reminder, a spark. But how far would those ripples travel? And who would they touch next? The hug ended in the courtroom, but the story of that embrace was only beginning. Within hours, the footage spread like wildfire, leaping from a local news segment in Providence to social media feeds across the globe. What had started as an ordinary municipal case over a minor infraction now carried the emotional weight of a cultural event. The clip was short, barely 30 seconds long. But in those 30 seconds, millions found a reason to pause their scrolling, wipe their eyes, and share. The caption that trailed behind it, hastily typed by a local reporter, became the spark that ignited a viral blaze. Defendant asks judge for a hug. What happened next left the courtroom in tears. Asterisk on Twitter, hashtags bloomed overnight, hashtag justice with compassion, hashtag Caprio hug, hashtag I can give you a hug. TikTok creators stitched the clip into montages with sad piano music, then shifted into soaring crescendos as the applause filled the courtroom. Reaction videos flooded in teens in bedrooms, mothers in kitchens, veterans in recliners, all wiping away tears and whispering some version of this. This is what humanity should look like. Instagram Reels looped the moment endlessly. The trembling request, the pause, the walk, the embrace. Overlaid text screamed, "Dignity bureaucracy." Celebrities reposted it. Politicians retweeted it with captions like, "This is what leadership means." By morning, it wasn't just a courtroom hug. It was a movement. Late-night talk show hosts couldn't resist. One leaned back in his chair, mock serious. Folks, today in Providence, a defendant didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked for a hug. And for once, the judge didn't slam the gavel. He opened his arms. The audience roared with applause before the host added, voice softening, "Honestly, maybe Washington could use a little of that." Newspapers carried headlines like, "And compassion becomes the verdict. Judge Caprio's hug breaks internet. Restores faith in humanity." 6 words that shook a courtroom and the world. Editorials poured in, contrasting Caprio's act with the harshness of the justice system elsewhere. Where other judges were mocked for cruelty or indifference, Caprio was held up as proof that kindness could coexist with the law. In coffee shops, strangers replayed the clip on their phones, showing friends with whispered, "You have to see this." On radio talk shows, callers choked up recounting the moment, saying it reminded them of fathers, mothers, teachers who once chose mercy over punishment. But not all voices agreed. A few critics questioned whether such moments undermined the seriousness of justice. What's next? One columnist asked. Group therapy sessions instead of fines? Their words sparked fiery debates online. Was compassion a weakness in courtrooms? Or was it the missing strength? Yet even in debate, one thing was clear. The moment had struck a chord far too deep to dismiss. Emails poured into the courthouse. Letters arrived from across the country, from single parents drowning in debt, from veterans struggling with PTSD, from teenagers caught in minor infractions, who feared their lives would be defined by mistakes. They all said the same thing. "Thank you for showing us it doesn't have to be this way." One handwritten note stood out. "Judge Caprio, I saw you hug that man. My son is in jail for something small, and he feels like no one sees him as human anymore. You gave me hope." The hug, it turned out, was not just about one defendant. It became a symbol for countless unseen struggles. Asterisk, meanwhile, in the narrative of the courtroom villain, the cold, faceless system, the hug was like a crack in a marble statue. A single act of warmth had exposed how brittle the machinery of bureaucracy truly was. Memes flourished. One split screen showed a robotic judge stamping papers on the left, and Caprio's embrace on the right, with the caption, "Choose your justice." Another showed a towering wall labeled "System," crumbling as two stick figures hugged beneath it. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone. For years, people had felt crushed by fines, tickets, and rules that didn't care about circumstance. Now, in 30 seconds of footage, they saw someone fighting back, not with rebellion, but with humanity. Asterisk, as the days passed, the clip didn't fade, it grew. Politicians referenced it in speeches. Activists cited it in campaigns for reform. Teachers showed it to students as a lesson in empathy, and then came whispers of something larger. Petitions calling for Caprio's way to become more than a moment, to become a model. Articles speculated whether the judge's philosophy could reshape courts across the country, because if one hug could ripple through millions of hearts in a single week, what might happen if entire systems embraced the same compassion? The question lingered, tantalizing, unfinished. Was this just one extraordinary courtroom moment? Or the beginning of a movement that could change justice itself? Asterisk, in the quiet that followed the storm of attention, one truth began to emerge with piercing clarity. This moment wasn't just about a hug. It was about what that hug represented. For decades, Judge Caprio had insisted that the law, though necessary, should never lose its heart. To him, justice without compassion was little more than cold arithmetic numbers. Fines, punishments stacked on paper, while real people carried invisible burdens beneath them. And in that Providence courtroom, its belief crystallized into a living parable. The defendant's trembling voice had carried the weight of millions, who have felt crushed by systems too rigid to see them. In asking for a hug, he wasn't asking for escape. He wasn't asking to erase the law. He was asking for acknowledgement, for someone in power to say, "I see you. I hear you. You matter." That is why the embrace drew tears, not laughter. It wasn't sentimental. It was revolutionary. Asterisk, the world has no shortage of punishers. Every day people are told they're less than their mistakes, defined by what they owe, condemned by what they failed to meet. Despair is plentiful. But dignity? Dignity is rare. Judge Caprio's hug was not weakness, it was strength. It declared that even within the walls of bureaucracy, even with a gavel in hand, a human being could choose humanity over humiliation. The system had written the defendant as a case number. Caprio rewrote him as a person. And in doing so, he reminded us that justice isn't truly blind. It sees most clearly when it looks with compassion. Asterisk. The hug traveled across borders because it spoke a universal language. It said to immigrants struggling in silence, to workers fighting poverty, to families fractured by loss, you are more than what the system labels you. You carry worth no fine can erase. It's why teachers showed the clip in classrooms, why parents shared it at dinner tables, why social media feeds overflowed with comments like, "This made me believe in people again," because beneath the robes, the titles, the headlines, we are all human beings searching for the same thing, recognition of our dignity. Asterisk, what began as a local case became a mirror for society at large. If a small courtroom in Providence could model a justice that listens before it punishes, why couldn't others? If one judge could show mercy without surrendering fairness, why couldn't whole systems learn to do the same? This was the deeper moral. Compassion doesn't weaken justice, it completes it. Rules without empathy create oppression, but empathy without rules creates chaos. True justice lives in the balance, in that day. Judge Caprio showed the balance in action. Asterisk the hug became more than a headline. It became a question for everyone watching. How do we carry this spirit beyond the courtroom? Do we see the cashier struggling at the register? Do we notice the neighbor weighed down by grief? Do we remember that every stranger we pass carries a story we'll never know? Caprio's hug was not only about one man's confession, it was a challenge to all of us. To replace suspicion with kindness, judgment with understanding, punishment with the possibility of redemption. Asterisk and yet, even as the viral moment settled into legend, the story was not over. Because one final truth remained, one that would tie the hug, the confession, and the reaction together in a way no one expected. As Judge Caprio walked away from that bench, leaving the world buzzing in his wake, he left us with an unspoken invitation. What if we too chose to live as if dignity mattered more than bureaucracy? The answer to that question would determine not only how we remember this moment, but how we define justice in the years to come. Asterisk. And so, we return to where it all began, to a trembling voice asking a question that seemed impossibly small, yet carried the weight of a nation's conscience. Judge, can I give you a hug? Those 6 words became more than a request. They became a reminder that dignity can rise from despair, that compassion can break through walls of bureaucracy, that even in a system designed to calculate fines and tally mistakes, humanity can still prevail. The gavel is heavy, but so is the heart. And on that day in Providence, it was the heart that ruled. Asterisk, the hug didn't erase the law. It didn't rewrite the books. But it did something far greater. It showed that justice can have a human face. That kindness is not weakness, but courage. And that in moments when cruelty seems easier, choosing compassion can be the most powerful verdict of all. This is the America worth. It's believing in not an America of cold transactions and faceless bureaucracy, but an America where ordinary people can still be seen, still be heard, still be embraced. Asterisk, if this moment touched you, don't let it fade into another clip lost in the scroll. Share it to remind the world that dignity matters more than fines, that compassion is stronger than cruelty. And if you believe justice should always carry a human face, subscribe now. Stand with us, because together, our voices can make sure that this story is not an exception, but the beginning of a new standard. The courtroom may have fallen silent that day, but the echo of that hug still lingers, asking each of us the same question. Will we choose dignity over despair?